Hello again and welcome to the Pastor Study. I'm the pastor, Dave Thomas. We're here in my study at Cross of Christ Lutheran Church in beautiful Bellevue, Washington. And this is the study for March 7th, 2021. An important marker or a milestone in the life of Cross of Christ as we not celebrate but commemorate. Commemorate 1 year since we had to suspend in person in the sanctuary worship due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be, this Sunday, the 63rd recorded worship service over that 1 year period. And so to mark this, we're doing something different this Sunday. It will still be a worship service, and we hope it's still worshipful. It will still have prayers and blessings, music, announcements, benedictions, and such, but there won't be a sermon. Instead, Ben Fowler, our Director of Worship and Music Ministries, Colin Walker, our congregational president, but also the editor and producer of all of our videos, and I will be having a panel discussion as we share things that we've learned and experienced in this past year. We'll talk about technical skills we've gained. We'll talk theology and what we've learned or what we've continued to ponder about what worship is all about, what's at the heart of worship, which is the theme for this Sunday, the heart of worship. We'll be joined via video by a few others, including our pastor for Caring Ministries, Judy Brennan, who has preached for us this year, has led worship, has recorded prayers and lessons. Our organist, Dean Robinson, will speak to you about his experience of playing in this unusual kind of setting. And then Matt Poley, our super team member who just does so much for us, part of the recording team with Colin, Ben, and myself, shares a little bit from his perspective. So we look forward to having you join us in that very special service. There will also still be 4 lessons, an Old Testament, Psalm, New Testament, and Gospel lesson. However, they're not from the Revised Common Lectionary. They're not for Lent 3, as it were. They are for this milestone. And so Colin, Ben, and I each picked one of those scriptures. But we let Ben pick 2 because after all, he's going to seminary and he should be as fresh up on his Bible knowledge as any of us. So I'll tell you who picked what, and we'll look at those scriptures. In this episode, we're going to do what we always do. We're going to look at the lessons for this Sunday, just not the ones assigned for a normal Lent 3 in a 3-year cycle, but for this 1 year marker. And we'll start with the first lesson. It's a very good place to start. The Old Testament lesson is one that I chose. It's just a single verse from Jeremiah 29:11, well known and much beloved and appreciated by many. And it is this: "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." Here the Hebrew behind it is, I know the intentions I have for you. I know the thoughts I have about you. I know the design for your future that I have for you, declares the Lord, that is Yahweh. So God here reveals that God ponders and considers and thinks about and plans for his people. And I find that very comforting. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you." The word for prosper here is the word salom, which is related to shalom. It means peace, but has a greater meaning than that. It means wholeness, welfare, for your well-being, even salvation is an implication in this word. So I know the plans I have for you, plans for your well-being, for your welfare, and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. The word hope here in Hebrew means not like a random wish, make a wish and blow out the candles. It's an expectation built on something solid. It's something that you're assured will happen in the future and that you look forward to. Plans to give you expectations, plans to give you something to look forward to based on Yahweh's faithfulness, that God is a promise keeper. So I'm going to just read it through one more time because it's short. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Or some translations say to give you a hope-filled future. Now Jeremiah speaks these words as God's messenger to Jewish people who had been living in a difficult time in the life of Israel. They had lived first under the domination of one major empire, the Egyptian, and then later, basically right after that, the Babylonians. I think it's hard for us to imagine, probably, in our time, what it would be like to live under the stress of colonial occupation, of being under another authority. Of course, you reach back into the U.S. history, and there is, the colonial experience and the breaking from that. And yet we have also been colonizers. And so it's not an experience any of us in our lifetime are very familiar with. However, we do know the feeling of being separated from something that is important to us, a home. In this case, for this past year, our church home, the physical place where we gather to be the church and to worship together as a church, the church building. The church is the people, but our facility, our sanctuary, is the place where we typically gather for worship. And so I think we can understand, we can appreciate this exile experience that the people that Jeremiah is speaking to, the people that God is speaking to through Jeremiah, were going through, at least to an extent. And that's why I chose this, because right in the midst of that, while they were still in exile in Babylon, and when there was no real light at the end of the tunnel yet, there was no sign that the exile, this exilic experience, was about to end anytime soon, God speaks these words of promise and hope. So we'll share more about that in the recorded service for this Sunday. Ben picked the psalm. It's Psalm 137. It's usually titled something like a hymn expressing the lamentations of the Jewish people in exile following the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Okay, usually it's titled something shorter than that, like a lament, or the lament of the exiles. But it connects with, and we didn't do this, we didn't plan it out, we all just picked on our own, but it connects very much with the Jeremiah context of Babylon and exile. And so Ben picked this to share. It starts, by the rivers of Babylon. Now Babylon is a name for a land that today we would know as, primarily as Iraq. Babylon extends into Kuwait, partway into Syria, into far southern Turkey. Another name for it through history has been Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia literally means the middle of the rivers, or in the midst of the rivers. And the rivers of Babylon, the two rivers between which, or in the middle of, that this land is fixed, are the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So the Tigris and the Euphrates, the land in between is the Mesopotamia, land of Mesopotamia, or Babylon. This is the land of exiles for the Jews at the time of the Psalm and of Jeremiah. So here's a side note for you. You may know this. Potomas means river. We get the Potomac River, which literally means the river, the name of the river just outside of Washington, D.C. from this. So Potomas and means river, and hippos means horse. Potomas in Latin, I believe, but in Greek as well. But reaching back to this naming of Mesopotamia, not in Hebrew, even though it's Babylon in the Hebrew scriptures, but Potomas River, hippos, horse. So actually, you probably know this, a hippodrome is another name for a horse racing track. But a hippopotamus then literally is a river horse. And I've seen many hippos in my time living in Africa, and they do kind of have a equine effect about them, especially when they just have their heads above water. So there you are, for what it's worth. Enough sidetracking. Some of it valuable, talking about where is Babylon and what are these two rivers, and a little bit maybe less so. hippopotamus, but it's still fun. So let's move on. By the rivers in Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. Now Zion refers to Israel, but more specifically it refers to Jerusalem. And even more specifically, it refers to the easternmost of the two hills of ancient Jerusalem. And these hills together are often referenced as Mount Zion. And it's at this site where David conquers Jebusite city, David the king of Israel and of Judah in the 10th century BC. This is recorded in Samuel chapter 5, and he establishes then upon these two hills, the Mount Zion, his royal capital. But I think, I'm at it again, maybe going a little off track, but when you hear Zion, it is another name, another reference to the royal city and the sacred city, the holy city of Jerusalem. So there we sat and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps. They put their musical instruments aside. They hung them in the trees, no longer playing them in the heartbreak of exile. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, quote, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." So this is not an actual, hey, will you sing us a song? It is a mockery. It is a derisive request. It's rubbing salt in the wounds of the exiles. It's basically like saying, hey, captives, sing us your old songs, from back in the day, back before we sacked your city and carried you off here to basically serve as slaves. Go on, a 1 and a 2 and a go and sing. So it's not a nice thing. They're mocking them. They're rubbing it in. And the exiles are feeling the torment. They're called tormentors. As we think about that, we may reflect that that's how white folk in the time of slavery in the United States did to black folk. Hey, sing us a song, entertain us. After you've worked for us and done all the toil, now entertain us. And some would say, in some form or another, that dominant white society still does that to folks of color. Hey, entertain us. Hey, sing us a song from back in your heritage. Entertain us. Something to think about. So sing us one of the songs of Zion, the tormentors ask, and how do the exiles respond? How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, is how this part of the psalm ends. How could we sing the song of Yahweh when we live in a foreign land? Because the place to sing the sacred songs, the place to do worship, the place to sing the songs of praise in the hearts and the minds of Jews of that time was Zion, was Jerusalem, and specifically the temple. And all of that was taken from them, and they were quite literally taken away from all of that, taken from Zion. And so they couldn't imagine how they could sing, how they could worship if they weren't in their worship home. So Ben will think with us this Sunday about the implications for us in our exile experience, unable to worship in our place, face to face together inside the sanctuary. And what does that mean? How can we worship? Can we? Should we? And if so, what does it mean to worship outside of the space that for many of us has defined the place to worship? How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, away from Zion, away from the sanctuary? So that's where we'll go with that. Colin picked our New Testament lesson, the second lesson. It is from Romans chapter 12, verse 1 to 5. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Rome, not a church he founded. In fact, he's writing in advance of his visit there and kind of laying out his doctrine. He's also setting them up to ask for their advice in missionary journeys that he's planning beyond which do not come to fruition because things happen in Rome to Paul. But as he writes, that's his intent. And so he writes this in verse 12. I appeal to you, he says. The Greek here is to urge or to implore. In older versions of English versions, like the King James, it says, I beseech you. Well, actually it says, I beseech thee. Therefore, brothers and sisters, the Greek word here is adelphoi. It's from the same root as filio, meaning brotherly or brotherly, sisterly, sibling, family, love. We get the name of the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Filio, brotherly love from that. So Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, and we now use more inclusive language, brothers and sisters. And here he doesn't mean kin, obviously. He means brothers in a sense, not by kinship, by extension, by connection. This word is mostly used in the New Testament to refer to fellow Christians, and inclusively both male and female. So I beseech you, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which we may have heard this before, but it should stop us because it's a contradiction in terms. It's kind of an oxymoron. In that a sacrifice, this sense of sacrifice to Paul, who was raised a very fervent and zealous Jew, a Pharisee, and was a rising star in kind of what we might think of as a very conservative, far-right branch of the Pharisee movement in his time. And to other Jews, this terminology about a sacrifice would harken back to the Old Testament temple rituals of offering an animal to be burned or killed in religious ceremony. So a living sacrifice is a contradiction in terms, and yet that's what Paul is calling our offering ourselves to God, to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. The new thank offering isn't a bull or a goat or a dove. It's the lived out lives of those who have been saved by grace through the immeasurable acts of love of Jesus Christ. And he says, offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And that's the concept we're going to talk about in that panel discussion. That this expands the idea of the concept of worship beyond the temple or the synagogue or church services or Sunday or the Lord's Day or even when we gather. And all of that's still important. And Paul encourages it elsewhere. He says, do not neglect the gathering of the saints. And yet, worship isn't just what we do when we come together in a space, but it is the presenting of our whole selves, even our whole bodies, of representing our whole selves, and how we live out our faith day to day, following the teachings and examples of Jesus. That is our spiritual worship. And then he says, do not be conformed to this world. There's an interesting Greek word here that we translate into English as conformed. And the English has this in it too, but we're just so used to the figurative sense of conform that the literal sense, which it shares with the Greek, may be lost. The Greek, and the English, frankly, too, mean literally to take the shape of another by the use of a mold or a pattern or a form, like the way one might make a bowl or shape metal using a form or a mold, right? Conformed. Figuratively, it means to be bent into the shape of something else. And in this sense, as Paul's writing, he says, don't be molded, formed. Don't take on the same shape, the same form of this world. Paul beseeches Christians to not let the values, ethics, morals, and ways of this world shape them, but rather, continuing in verse 2, be transformed. And that's another cool Greek word. You'll know it. It's metamorpho, and it means a great change, a change across forms, or a transformation. Meta meaning major or significant, morph meaning form. A metamorph is to be greatly changed, to be completely transformed. Most of us learn the word metamorphosis in school or maybe at home when we're being taught about caterpillars and butterflies and that complete change of form. A butterfly doesn't look anything like a caterpillar, nor does a caterpillar look anything like a butterfly. And so it's a call here to be completely changed. And how does that happen? Paul, going on, says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In the original Greek, the word here is used, it means the perfecting of your mind or the fixing of your mind. It implies to be better than new. What we might say today, like we might refer to like getting a makeover or doing a makeover of our house to bring it back to where it was new, or maybe even better. That's this sense of being of this renewing of your mind, so that you may discern. That is, you may be able to prove. It has a sense like a math equation where you can work it out and have a proof. You can show something to be true. You can figure out, so that you can prove, so that you can discern what is the will of God. That is what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment. So Paul uses, in English it comes, think is used 3 times, and Paul uses a Greek root in 3 different ways. The first, he says, do not think more highly of yourself. It's a very cool Greek compound word, uperphroneo, and it means, the implication is to be conceited or haughty, to literally have too high, to uper, of an opinion of yourself. Then you ought to think, but think with sober judgment. Now, several other English translations of this verse don't say sober judgment, but they say sound judgment. And that's probably better. Sober is technically accurate, but because of its other meaning, sober being, an antonym for drunk or intoxicated, it could throw us off. So I like, but think with sound judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. And Colin's going to focus on that when he shares about why he picked that scripture, and Ben and I will probably jump in and say something, or just nod approvingly with what Colin says. This metaphor of the body, the church as a body. And I think we think often about that we are the body of Christ, but we are also, as Paul points out, we are connected with Christ in our connection with the church, but we are also members of one another, equally connected there. All right, so that's the second lesson, the New Testament lesson. Finally, the gospel is from John, the 4th chapter, verses 20 to 24. Ben selected this. And this is John's recording, recollection, sharing of an encounter to which he was not a witness, and no one else was, just the 2 people involved, one of them being Jesus. So I have to imagine that Jesus told his disciples all the details, because they were off trying to purchase food in the village when all this happened. This is the happening. This is the encounter between Jesus and a Samaritan woman at an ancient well in her homeland, Samaria. Now, Samaria is the historical biblical name for a region in Israel, ancient Israel. And it's roughly bordered by Galilee, where Jesus comes from, to the north, and Judea, where Jerusalem is seated, to the south, and roughly it goes all the way west to the Mediterranean Sea and all the way east to the Jordan River. So that is generally the land of the Samaritans. Samaritans, like Jews, trace their history all the way back to Father Abraham. And specifically, they were linked to 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel and 2 of then the 12 sons of Joseph, Joseph being the great-grandson of Abraham and Sarah by way of Isaac and Jacob. And those 2 sons, the tribes of the Samaritans, are Ephraim and Manasseh. 12 sons, 12 tribes, and these 2 link the Samaritans with the Jews. Now, Samaritans had broken off from historical Judaism and from Israel long before even the time of Jesus. It's somewhat debated about when that may have happened. Some even date it back to the time of the Babylonian exile, when some were taken off into Babylon and some were left and they scattered. And some historians think that was the time when those who were Jewish moved into this region and kind of became isolated and separated and kind of branched off. Now, you probably are aware that there was a lot of enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. So much so that one time Jesus tells a story, and to give it greater impact and an unexpected twist, he made the hero of one of his parables about how to be a good neighbor, he made that person a Samaritan. In fact, that parable is called the parable of the Good Samaritan, because to a Jew of that day, that was an oxymoron. Good and Samaritan would not have gone together in their minds. So we have this encounter between a woman of Samaria, in Samaria, at Jacob's well with Jesus. And at the part we're going to look at of this encounter in John 4 highlights one of the major issues, disagreements, breaking points between the Jews and the Samaritans. There had long been not really a debate, just an entire disagreement about where was the proper or right location. What was the chosen place, the correct place to worship God? Now, according to Judaism, that was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in Zion. But the Samaritans considered Mount Gerizim to be the holy mountain. And there's Old Testament connections to Mount Gerizim. So in this conversation, Jesus is going to answer that debate, going to enter into this centuries-old discussion, and he's going to answer once and for all. But he's going to do so in a very unexpected way. And I imagine the woman, the Samaritan woman, was very surprised by his answer, as would have been the disciples when he relays it later. So we're going to start at verse 20 as we drop into this event at this ancient well in Samaria. As Jesus passes through that region on his way back to Galilee, back into his home territory, and meets this woman at the well who was there at midday, some say at an unusual time, to draw water, and is surprised that a Jewish man strikes up a conversation with her. And this is part of the conversation. She says to Jesus, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain," that is Gerizim, "and you, the Jews, say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews." That is, Jesus isn't, saying, we're better than you are. Jesus is noting that there is a covenantal promise that goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and through their descendants would come the Messiah. Salvation, the Messiah, comes from the Jews. "But the hour is coming," he goes on, and is now here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in, and my sense is she's waiting for it, what is it? Is it in Jerusalem? Is it at Mount Zion? Is it the Temple Mount? Is it the Samaritan Holy Mountain, Mount Gerizim? Where is it? And Jesus says, the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And that's just mind-blowing. Because worship, Jesus is saying, isn't supposed to be in this place or in that place. The physical place doesn't matter. It's where we're at in our spirit, in our minds, and in our hearts when we worship. There's no single place where one must be to worship God. Not a temple, not a synagogue, not a church building, not a sanctuary. The place you have to be is in that worshipful space in your heart, in your soul. Jesus goes on to explain that in the second part of verse 22. For the Father seeks such as these, those who worship in spirit and truth, to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. So Ben and Colin and I will wrestle with this together in a conversation, that panel discussion on Sunday too, about where and about how we worship, and the lessons we've learned about that when we have been exiles, when we have been away from the sanctuary now for a full year. Well, I very much look forward to sharing this this special, bittersweet, momentous Sunday. Bitter because we've had to be apart. Sweet that we've stayed together differently and continued to be the church and to do the work of God's people in our own community, one with another, in our greater Crossroads and Lake Hills and Bellevue community, and indeed, around the world. We want to note that and give God thanks. We will also note that in that 1 year since we suspended in-person worship, we've recorded 63 worship services. And I'm going to note for you, fellow disciples, Bible students, those who hang out with me here in the pastor study, that we didn't start the pastor study immediately, but we picked it up pretty soon. And this is the 32nd episode of this time when we look at the text together for the coming Sunday as I prepare for worship and for the sermon, and that you prepare yourselves as well. So thanks. Thanks for joining me here today for this week. And thanks for being here in the pastor study and being in study of God's word with me for this past year. I hope you found these to be useful and informative, maybe a little entertaining from time to time. And we'll continue with them at least until our physical time of separation ends, and probably beyond that, so we can include even more as we grow together in faith. So now, as we end, as always, let us be doers of God's word and not hearers only. Hope to see you again soon, right here in the Pastor Study. Until then, God bless and goodbye.